It was probably one of the best things. I mean, we grew up in a small town that I think all parents were comfortable that your kids were kind of on your own. We lived outdoors, I mean, fishing, everything. And so we'd be playing on the beach or we'd be playing somewhere. And, you know, it was dinner time, Mom would be screaming out the door, "It's 5 o'clock, get home for dinner." Or dinner was at 5 and you better be there, table was set. So it was a great place to live. When I was a child, there really wasn't that much services there for medical. I remember as a small child, I was out sports fishing and I casted the pole and I had ripped my ear in half. And I think at the local parsonage had, I don't know if it was his wife or whatever, and she sewed my ear back together and everything was fine, but that was the first time I had encountered it as a child.
About 500 miles southwest of Anchorage, at the easternmost tip of the Alaska Peninsula, is the ancestral home of the Aleutian people. They have called this land home for thousands of years, learning how to live with nature and all its beauty and fury. Surrounded by the North Pacific Ocean and the Bering Sea, these fertile waters provide a living for most, but it's also where many lose their lives.
My dad is Glenn Gardner Sr. He was having pains and whatnot that were, you know, out of the ordinary. It was happening for a few years. You know, he'd gone to the clinic and, you know, they gave him quinine for leg cramps. And obviously that wasn't the problem. And so later he finally said, I have to go to Anchorage. And that's when they made a diagnosis. And he had stage 4 colon cancer. And at that point, you know, it's too late, and then it just spread to its whole body, like in a blink of the eye. And that all comes back to the services that we were being given in Sandpoint. So that was tough.
Another life gone, taken way too soon, by a disease that if caught early has a 70% survival rate. This made Glenn wonder, why did his dad have to die?
You know, they should have been more involved in the community. They should have been doing outreach programs for certain things that were prevalent in our area. You see a lot of cancers in our area. They should have been looking for those kind of things.
The lack of fundamental basic health care took another life in the community, and people started to wonder why.
At some point in time, I think the community realized, in looking at Aleutian Pribilof Island Association, and you know, we're thankful for what they did. However, knowingly the amount of grant funds that they were receiving to provide health care and the state behavioral health funds, that we thought we should be able to have a better quality of care. And so we got together, different representatives, and we held public meetings.
And we decided that it was time that we pulled our healthcare dollars away from APA and start our own organization.
We worked with the tribal councils and the corporations and the city governments, and you know, to say, you know, do you support this or will you support this?
And that's when we happened to run across Palmyra, which was a godsend.
Originally, I was coming out for about a year, maybe 2 years, with the intent of evaluating the health system for the Eastern Aleutian borough. The evaluation part was going from village to village and speaking with the tribal councils, the tribal leaders, and speaking with members of the community about healthcare concerns, about their families, about health issues, loved ones who had passed away.
With every village Palmyra visited, she came to the realization that Glenn's story was not unique.
Many families shared with me a loved one who had passed, and when I would ask clinically, you know, what happened, what was the condition, when were they diagnosed, when I sort of digged a little deeper, it became clear that there were these enormous gaps in terms of health care. What I did really know is that the government and public policy, really, all of that provided enormous trauma to the indigenous people and also killed them.
Armed with this new information, the tribal leaders came to the consensus that something needed to be done.
We approached the current Alaskan Native provider of health, which was APIA. the Aleutian Pribilof Island Association. And there were members from the tribal councils on this board. However, they didn't feel like they had a voice. And when they did speak up, to say, you know, this isn't right, I don't understand why my mother died. I don't understand why this was not diagnosed earlier. There was not a response. This was not acceptable. I spent years at the Heller School for Social Justice. So my doctorate training and my, sort of years in the field were saying, now wait a minute, this just doesn't jive. This doesn't make sense.
So she started to learn everything she could about the Indian Self-Determination Act. After all, that act was the foundation for the healthcare system for Alaska Natives.
And through that, it became clear, well, you know what? These are recognized tribes. They can disengage from APIA and they can create their own healthcare system. So off I went to meet with Indian Health Services to let them know, saying, well, you know what? Speaking for the 7 tribes, and I want to point this out, and they want to disengage. Their response was, well, no. You can't do that. There's an economy of scale, the best that they can get is the community health aid program, and they really can't get, anything else. So I said, well, that doesn't really make sense. So my first meeting with them, I left feeling very sick and nauseous and very, very, very sad. Very, very, very sad.
But that feeling didn't last too long. After a while, that sadness became determination.
I went and gathered the additional evidence saying, okay, why are people in the Aleutians dying 15 years earlier than anyone else? Why are these people dying earlier? Why are people dying of illnesses that are treatable? And this is just good primary and preventative care. There's no magic here. I'm not a, Rhodes Scholar. These are things that are well known, that are completely ignored. We're being completely ignored by the current entity that was entrusted with the health of the people of the Eastern Aleutian tribes. So I went back with the evidence, and the response, I'll never forget this. The response was, well, you know what, if people are dying earlier, it's really their fault. They need to move to Anchorage.
So off Palmyra went, back to let the tribal council know that the Indian Health Services solution was to move to Anchorage. To everyone, this was not a reasonable solution, and that the real problem was the Indian Health Services and the APIA. At this point, they felt their path was clear.
Okay, so we now need to declare. We need to put the line in the sand, file the paperwork. We worked with the lawyer, became a 501(c), tribal entity, put everything together, and then submitted this.
And so that was basically the development of Eastern Aleutian tribes.
Along with creating the Eastern Aleutian tribes, the papers they filed gave them all the funding and the responsibility of running their own healthcare system. And all those dollars that normally went to the Indian Health Services, well, Palmyra says they weren't too happy about losing those funds.
And when it was sort of stamped by Washington, when we got permission to go forward, I went back to them. They accused me of going native. What was wrong with me? And supporting this direction. It was like, it was a very, very troubling, disturbing experience.
Afterwards, Palmyra says IHS wouldn't negotiate with EAT. And if they wanted to get the funds, EAT would have to get APIA to relinquish them.
So Glenn and I went to the meeting with their president and executive director at APIA to sort of negotiate. And they were wanting to give us a very small amount of money, saying that our census was so much lower than the Pribilof Islands. And
But we were prepared for that, both Glenn and I. We were prepared because we knew that the census data was incorrect. This happened a lot. They don't take the census well out in the villages. And so we came with our numbers, said, no, I'm sorry. We know we've already contacted the Census Bureau and let them know that they do not have the appropriate count of the people who live in the community, and this is the count.
In the end, the members of the Eastern Aleutian tribes won out, getting the money that was rightfully theirs.
In a lot of ways, the work then began because it was a small seed money from Indian Health Services, and then we needed to get the clinics up and running so we could do third-party billing. We needed to become Medicare providers and get our Medicare numbers. So there were all these things that we needed to do to diversify our funding base, and so that we could get the level of clinical expertise necessary within each of these communities.
And it was a tough thing, but I think everybody was driven, along with the people that we got together. They were tired of the health care that was being provided by this organization and the needless things that were happening. It wasn't just in the community of Sandpoint. It was happening in King Cove. It was happening in False Pass. It was happening in Aleutian.
What I do have to say is that the tribal leadership at the time, including Glenn and everyone from all the tribes, they all had very personal experiences of a loved one who didn't get treatment, or when they got treatment, the illness had progressed so far that there was no hope. And that was the motivating thing.
But I'm very proud of all the people in every community. They came together and they bonded. They jumped many hurdles, and at the end of the day, the outcome was good health care.